Marrying an Arab billionaire, the dream marriage of a young American girl, quickly turned a nightmare she couldn't escape. The airport buzzed with a relentless hum of voices, a blur of movement as strangers crossed paths. Yet Catherine felt utterly still, trapped in the whirlwind of her own racing thought. Her hands were clasped so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, a futile attempt to ground herself. She stood at the arrivals gate, her gaze fixed on the sliding doors as if willing them to open. Every second stretched unbearably, her chest tightening with each tick of the clock. Beside her, two customs officers exchanged murmured words, their expressions unreadable. Their presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the stakes. Catherine felt the weight of everything, every choice, every sacrifice, pressing down on her as she waited. Then the doors parted. A young officer emerged, flanked by 4 children. They walked hesitantly, their small forms a mixture of caution and curiosity. For a moment, Catherine froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred as tears welled up, and she didn't notice her feet moving until she was running. "Mom!" The eldest boy's voice rang out, cracking with raw emotion. He broke into a sprint, his arms wide, colliding into her embrace with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. His sister followed, her cry of "Mama!" shaking with joy. The twin boys lingered, their small hands clutching one another, their eyes unsure but longing. Catherine knelt, opening her arms to them, her voice trembling as she whispered their names. Slowly, they stepped forward, and the moment they fell into her embrace, she wept freely. The hall around them seemed to vanish. There was only the feel of their arms around her, the sound of their voices calling her name, the overwhelming rush of love and relief. This was a moment she had dreamed of, fought for, clung to in her darkest hours. Behind her, Catherine's parents watched through tear-filled eyes. They clung to each other as sobs overtook them, their emotions raw and uncontained. This reunion wasn't just the end of a long journey. It was the culmination of a story that had begun long ago, in a summer filled with hope and promises, a summer that had changed everything. Barcelona, that summer, was alive, its cobblestone streets painted with the golden light of the Mediterranean sun. Street performers played lilting melodies on violins, their music blending with the laughter of tourists and the chatter of vendors calling out their wares. The air smelled faintly of salt and citrus, the kind of fragrance that seemed to cling to the very soul of the city. Catherine, then a nurse in her early 20s, had come to escape the monotony of hospital corridors and the weight of her loneliness. She wandered aimlessly through Barcelona's winding alleys, marveling at the vibrant life spilling from every cafe and corner. Here, she thought, she could breathe, free from the unrelenting pace of her life back home in New York. On her 3rd day, she found herself at the Plaça de Catalunya, its iconic fountain gleaming under the midday sun. Tourists milled about, snapping pictures and tossing coins, while children chased pigeons that flapped lazily into the air. Catherine stood by the fountain, her fingers grazing the cool marble rim, when she noticed him. Samir. He was standing just across the fountain, a man in his late 30s with olive skin and dark, penetrating eyes. There was a quiet intensity about him, an energy that drew her gaze despite herself. His suit, though simple, fit him perfectly, and his posture was one of effortless confidence. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow. Catherine felt an inexplicable pull, as if the space between them had collapsed. Samir's lips curled into a hesitant smile, his expression both warm and distant, like a man carrying a story too heavy to share. When he approached, his Spanish was tinged with an accent she couldn't place, but his sincerity made up for the occasional stumble in words. Their conversation began awkwardly. He commented on the beauty of the fountain, She joked about the pigeons. But as they spoke, the barriers between them dissolved. Samir's laugh was rich and full, his humor quick but never sharp. As the afternoon wore on, the fountain became their silent wit. Samir reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin, its dull, silver glint catching the sunlight. "Do you believe in wishes?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Catherine chuckled, a little caught off guard. "I suppose that depends. What are you wishing for?" Instead of answering, he handed her the coin. "Together, then. A wish for both of us." They stood side by side at the edge of the fountain, their arms brushing just slightly. Catherine closed her eyes and whispered her hope into the coin. She didn't need to know what Samir wished for. The warmth of his presence was answer enough. The coins arced through the air and landed with a soft plink in the water. When Catherine opened her eyes, the fading sunlight painted the fountain in hues of amber and rose. Samir looked at her then, and something unspoken passed between them, a promise, or perhaps just the fragile start of one. As they walked away together, the city buzzed on, unaware of the story that had just begun under its watchful sky. Catherine sat with Samir at a small cafe nestled on a quiet street in Barcelona. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over their table, and the hum of life in the city seemed to fade as they spoke. There was an ease between them now, one that had developed over days of wandering the cobblestone streets and sharing unhurried conversations. "You're different," she said, studying him thoughtfully over the rim of her coffee cup, in a good way. Samir chuckled softly, his deep brown eyes glinting with humor. "I'll take that as a compliment." He leaned back, his expression growing pensive. "But I imagine different isn't always easy for people to understand." Catherine tilted her head. "No, it isn't, but I've never cared much about what others think. I like to judge people by how they make me feel." "And how do I make you feel?" Samir asked, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. She hesitated, then smiled. "Safe, curious, like I'm seeing the world through new eyes." Samir's lips curved into a small smile, but there was something deeper in his gaze. "You make me feel lighter, like I can breathe in a way I haven't for years." As they spoke, the walls between them crumbled further. Catherine shared stories of her life as a nurse, the long hours, the occasional heartbreak of losing patients, and the satisfaction of making a difference. Samir listened intently, his questions thoughtful and sincere. He, in turn, spoke of his home in Saudi Arabia, the traditions he cherished, and the expectations that weighed on him. "We come from such different worlds," Catherine said softly. "Sometimes it feels like a dream. This, you, all of it." "Dreams can be real," Samir replied, his voice steady, "but they take courage to hold on to." Back home in New York, Catherine's family didn't share her romantic optimism. Her parents had always been practical people, and the idea of their daughter falling for a man from a faraway land seemed more like a complication than a fairy tale. "Catherine, be realistic," her father had said during one particularly tense conversation. "How can you trust someone you've only just met, and someone so different?" "Different doesn't mean untrustworthy, Dad," Catherine replied, her tone firm but respectful. Her mother chimed in, her voice heavy with worry. "Honey, we just want what's best for you. You have a good job, a stable life here. What do you even know about this man?" "I know enough," Catherine said, her voice softening. "I know he's kind and honest, and he makes me feel alive in a way I haven't in years." But her words did little to ease their concerns. Over the following weeks, their objections grew louder, their arguments more insistent. Catherine felt the weight of their disapproval pressing down on her, pulling her in two directions at once. One night, she sat alone in her childhood bedroom, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort. She held a framed photo of her family, her thumb tracing the edges of the picture. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought about the life she was about to leave behind. The turning point came when Samir arrived in New York. He insisted on meeting her parents, despite knowing the reception might be frosty. Dressed impeccably and carrying himself with quiet dignity, he sat across from them in their modest living room, answering their questions with patience and sincerity. "I understand your concerns," he said, his voice steady but earnest. "I know this is not the life you envisioned for Catherine, but I love her. I respect her independence, her strength, and her heart. I want to build a life with her, not take her away from everything she loves." Catherine's parents exchanged glances, their expressions softening, if only slightly. Though their doubts remained, they couldn't deny the sincerity in Samir's words. That night, as Catherine walked Samir to his hotel, she felt the final pieces of her decision fall into place. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Samir replied, "because you're worth it." The day Catherine left for Saudi Arabia was bittersweet. Her parents hugged her tightly at the airport, their eyes filled with both love and sorrow. "Promise you'll call," her mother whispered, her voice breaking. "I will," Catherine promised, though she wasn't sure how often she could keep it. As she boarded the plane, her heart ached with the weight of goodbyes, but it also swelled with hope. She was choosing love despite the odds, and she carried with her the belief that it was a choice worth making. The first thing Catherine noticed upon arriving in Saudi Arabia was the air, a dry, warm breeze that carried the scent of distant dunes and something faintly floral. As the car wove through the city streets, the world outside her window grew increasingly surreal. Skyscrapers, sleek and modern, rose like glass monoliths alongside traditional sandstone buildings. Each turn brought another glimpse of opulence, but it wasn't until the car stopped in front of Samir's home that Catherine truly felt the weight of his world. The mansion stood like a palace from a storybook, its gleaming white walls reflecting the golden sunlight. Surrounding it, lush gardens flourished improbably in the arid landscape, with fountains bubbling softly amidst bursts of vivid flowers. The grandeur was overwhelming, yet it was the warmth of Samir's family that eased Catherine's nerves. His mother, elegant in her flowing abaya, greeted her with open arms, and his sisters hovered nearby, their curiosity tempered by polite smiles. Catherine felt swept into a whirlwind of dinners, introductions, and tours of the sprawling estate. Each room seemed more lavish than the last, adorned with ornate chandeliers and intricately patterned rugs. At night, she would sit with Samir on the balcony, the city lights shimmering like jewels in the distance. His charm, always so effortless, made her feel like she belonged in this strange, beautiful place. One evening, after a particularly grand dinner, Samir led Catherine into the garden. The sky above was a canvas of stars, undisturbed by city lights. They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps crunching lightly on the gravel path. Then Samir stopped and turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Catherine," he began, reaching into his pocket. She watched, her breath catching as he pulled out a small velvet box. "I never imagined meeting someone like you," he continued. "You've brought light into my life in ways I can't even describe. Will you do me the honor of being my wife?" The world seemed to hold its breath. Catherine's heart raced as she looked at him, his eyes filled with a sincerity that left her no room for doubt. "Yes," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, I will." The following weeks were a blur of preparations for a wedding that felt more like a royal celebration. Catherine found herself swept into a world of silks and gold, learning the customs and traditions that would shape the ceremony. The day of the wedding arrived with a sense of awe and disbelief. The estate was transformed into a vision of splendor. Lanterns hung from every tree, their soft glow mingling with the flicker of candlelight. Guests in elaborate attire filled the courtyard, their laughter and chatter a backdrop to the music that floated through the air. Catherine, clad in a gown that shimmered like moonlight, felt like she was walking through a dream. As Samir took her hand during the ceremony, she looked at him and saw not just the man she loved, but the promise of a new life, one filled with possibilities she had never imagined. But dreams, Catherine would soon learn, are fragile things. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A comment here, a look there. Samir's playful teasing about her attire turned into pointed suggestions. "Why don't you try wearing something more modest?" he asked one morning, his tone light but his gaze firm. Catherine, eager to adapt, complied, brushing aside the twinge of discomfort. Then came the moments of inexplicable anger. A misplaced item or an unanswered question could ignite a spark of frustration in Samir that seemed disproportionate. One evening, as they sat for dinner, his temper flared over a trivial misunderstanding. The warmth in his eyes turned cold, and his voice, usually so steady, cut through the air like a whip. Catherine tried to tell herself it was just stress, adjusting to a new marriage, the weight of family expectations. But as the weeks wore on, the unease within her grew. Samir's demands became more specific: whom she could speak to, where she could go. The easy laughter they once shared was replaced by a tension that hung between them like a heavy curtain. She often sat alone in the garden at night, gazing at the same stars that had borne witness to his proposal. The beauty of the place no longer felt comforting, it felt isolating. Catherine held on to the hope that the man she fell in love with was still there, somewhere beneath the growing shadows. For now, she resolved to wait, to give Samir and their marriage time. But deep down, a quiet fear had taken root, whispering that the life she had stepped into might not be the dream she had imagined. The days stretched long and heavy, their hours blending into nights that seemed never-ending. Catherine sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The silence of the house felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of Samir's pacing upstairs. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Midnight. Another sleepless night for him and for her. When they first married, Catherine believed her love and care could help Samir. She had approached his moods with the clinical precision of a nurse and the unwavering patience of a wife. She researched tirelessly, poring over articles and books about anxiety and depression. She prepared meals rich in nutrients, designed to boost his energy and stabilize his emotions. When his nights grew restless, she would sit by his side, holding his hand, whispering soft reassurances until he finally drifted to sleep. But nothing seemed to help. Lately, Samir's condition had worsened. He began taking sedatives prescribed to ease his migraines and sleeplessness. At first, Catherine was relieved, hopeful that the medication might bring him peace. Instead, it pushed him further into a fog. The man who once charmed her with his humor and wit now vacillated between sullen silence and erratic bursts of anger. It was during one of those bursts that Catherine first saw the shadow of a stranger in her husband. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were wild as he stormed into the living room, shouting accusations she could barely make sense of. He believed she had betrayed him, though he couldn't explain how or why. "Why do you hide things from me?" Samir demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "I don't hide anything," Catherine replied, her voice low and steady, though her hands trembled. "You think I don't see it? The way you speak to them, the way you laugh, he muttered, pacing back and forth, his movements erratic. Samir, she said softly, stepping toward him. There's no one else. It's just you and me. Always. But he turned away, shaking his head, his fists clenched. That night, she locked the bedroom door for the first time. In the weeks that followed, Samir's control tightened around her like a vice. He began setting rules, small at first, then increasingly suffocating. No more calls to your family, he said one morning over breakfast. His tone was casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. They fill your head with nonsense. Catherine stared at him, stunned. Samir, they're my family. And I'm your husband, he replied firmly, his gaze meeting hers. They don't understand our life here. It's better this way. Visits to friends became rare, then non-existent. Trips outside the house required his approval. Even her freedom to spend time alone in their garden was limited, as Samir claimed it wasn't safe. Catherine tried to push back, to reason with him, but each argument ended the same, with her retreating in exhaustion and him more convinced of his righteousness. She often found herself sitting in the quiet of her bedroom, staring at the phone she could no longer use, longing for the connection she once had with the outside world. Amidst the darkness, there came a glimmer of light. Catherine discovered she was pregnant. She held the test in trembling hands, her heart leaping with a mixture of joy and hope. This child, she thought, could change everything. Perhaps a baby would bring Samir the happiness that had eluded him, anchoring him in a way she never could. When she told him, his reaction was subdued. A child, he said, nodding slowly, as though he were weighing the implications. It will be good for us. But, as the days passed, Catherine's optimism began to wane. If anything, Samir's behavior grew more erratic. He became more protective, more watchful, convinced that the world outside their home posed a danger to their growing family. You're carrying our future, he told her one evening, his tone both tender and firm. I won't let anything harm you or the baby. At first, Catherine wanted to believe him, but as she lay awake that night, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of their home were closing in. What once seemed like love now felt like possession, and the hope she had clung to began to crack under the weight of his control. Catherine closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting to the life she had left behind, the open streets of New York, the laughter of her friends, the warmth of her family. She wanted to believe there was still a way forward, but with each passing day, the path seemed harder to find. The soft cries of a newborn pierced the stillness of the room. Catherine cradled her son, his tiny hand curling instinctively around her finger. Despite the exhaustion etched into her body, she smiled, marveling at the fragile life in her arms. He was her third child in 5 years, and though each birth brought new joy, the strain on her spirit had become unrelenting. In those first moments with each of her children, she found a rare clarity, a brief reprieve from the burdens that weighed on her. Catherine had imagined motherhood as a partnership, a shared joy with Samir, but that vision had long faded. Samir, increasingly consumed by his own anxieties and insecurities, remained distant, retreating further into his world of suspicion and control. Don't worry, Catherine whispered to the baby. You'll have everything you need. Her voice trembled, but she forced a steady smile. The days blurred into one another, a relentless cycle of feeding, bathing, and comforting. Catherine's arms ached from carrying her youngest, while her older children vied for her attention. Shazam, now 5, had become her little helper, often watching over his siblings while Catherine juggled endless tasks. His maturity beyond his years both warmed her heart and filled it with guilt. "Mum, I think Faye needs you," Shazam said one afternoon, his small hand tugging at her sleeve. "I'm coming, sweetheart," Catherine replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She reached for the baby bottle while mentally ticking off the other chores awaiting her. The laundry pile had doubled and the kitchen sink overflowed with dishes. Despite her love for her children, there was no denying the weight pressing down on her. She was exhausted in a way she hadn't thought possible. Samir's involvement in their lives was sporadic at best, his presence often more a source of tension than relief. "Why are they crying so much?" he snapped one evening, his tone sharp enough to make Catherine flinch. "They're just children," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. "You need to control them better," he muttered before disappearing into his study. Catherine held her tongue, but the ache in her chest deepened. Her world had become confined to the walls of their opulent home, a home that should have been a sanctuary, but felt increasingly like a prison. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the furniture was draped in rich fabrics, yet it all felt hollow. Catherine often found herself staring out the tall windows, longing for the simple, chaotic energy of the hospital where she once worked. She had tried to speak to Samir about returning to nursing, but his answer was always the same. "You don't need to work," he'd said dismissively. "Your place is here, with the children." His words left little room for argument. Every attempt to assert her independence was met with a wall of disapproval. Slowly, the vibrant woman she once was faded, replaced by someone who moved through her days like a shadow. Still, Catherine tried to hide her despair. She wanted her children to grow up with laughter and love, not burdened by the weight of their father's control. But Shazam saw through her mask. His dark eyes, so much like Samir's, often lingered on her face, filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. One evening, as Catherine tucked him into bed, he held her hand tightly. "Mum, are you okay?" he asked in a whisper. "I'm fine, darling," she replied, forcing a smile. "You don't need to worry about me." "But you look sad," he said, his brow furrowing. Catherine kissed his forehead, her heart breaking a little more. "I'm just tired. That's all. Sleep now." In the quiet moments after the children were asleep, Catherine allowed herself to feel the weight of her reality. She sat in the nursery, watching her youngest sleep, and let her tears fall freely. She missed her family back in America, their warmth, their unspoken understanding. She had tried reaching out, but every call was monitored, every letter intercepted. Her thoughts often drifted to Shazam's worried gaze. It was a painful reminder that her children, no matter how much she tried to protect them, were not immune to the tension in their home. Catherine clenched her fists, determination rising within her. For their sake, she would endure. She would smile through the pain and shield them from the storm that raged around them. Yet, deep down, a voice whispered, "This can't go on forever." And as she sat alone in the darkened room, Catherine began to wonder if there was a way out of the life she had built on love, but now lived in quiet desperation. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the muffled shuffle of Catherine's footsteps across the marble floor. She moved with care, her breath shallow as she held the framed photograph close to her chest. In the dim light, she traced the edges of the image with trembling fingers, the smiling faces of her parents and children frozen in happier times. It was a lifeline to the world she had lost, but Samir's voice shattered the quiet. "What is that?" he demanded, his tone edged with suspicion. Catherine froze as his shadow loomed in the doorway. His eyes burned with fury, and his jaw was set in a way that made her heart race with fear. "It's just a photo," she said softly, trying to mask the quake in her voice. She stepped back instinctively, clutching the frame tighter. But Samir's rage erupted. "A photo? Or proof of your betrayal?" His hand darted out, snatching the picture from her grasp. Catherine's protests fell on deaf ears as he stared at it, his expression twisting with jealousy and paranoia. "This is what you've been hiding," he growled, his voice rising with every word. Without warning, he tore the photo from its frame and ripped it to shreds, the sound of paper tearing like thunder in the suffocating room. "Samir, please!" Catherine's voice cracked, her hands reaching out as if she could somehow piece it back together. His fury boiled over, and before she could react, the back of his hand struck her face. The impact sent her reeling, the sharp sting radiating through her cheek. The pain wasn't just physical. It cut deep into her pride, her dignity, her very sense of self. For a moment the world stilled. Catherine touched her cheek, her breath catching as she felt the heat rise beneath her fingers. When she looked at him, she saw not the man she had loved, but a stranger consumed by anger and distrust. It was then she knew. She couldn't endure this any longer. The next days passed in a blur of quiet resolve. Catherine moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to draw attention. She hid her bruises with makeup and her determination behind a veil of compliance. But, inside, she planned. A kind housekeeper, Mariam, noticed Catherine's pain and offered her a lifeline. Mariam was from Kenya and had seen many women trapped in situations like this. "You don't deserve this," she whispered one evening, slipping a phone into Catherine's hand. "Call your family. Let them help you." With trembling fingers, Catherine dialed her parents. Her voice broke as she recounted the nightmare she was living. On the other end, her mother's sobs and her father's firm assurances gave Catherine the first glimmer of hope she had felt in years. They promised to do everything they could, reaching out to a lawyer in the US to explore her options. Days turned into weeks as Catherine prepared. She gathered what documents she could: her passport, a few personal effects, the legal papers Samir had carelessly left around. She avoided his gaze and his questions, keeping her movements cautious and deliberate. The night of her escape was supposed to be quiet, but it wasn't. Samir had found her stash of papers. His voice was low and cold when he confronted her. "You were going to leave," he said, holding up the evidence of her plans. "And take my children." Catherine's heart sank. Her carefully laid plans unraveled in an instant. Samir's fury was not the wild explosion of before. It was measured, calculated, and terrifying. He handed her a document, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "If you want freedom, sign this," he said. "You leave everything behind, your rights to the children, your place in this house. You walk away with nothing." Tears blurred her vision as she read the paper. The weight of her love for her children clashed against her desperation to escape. With shaking hands, she signed, each stroke of the pen a dagger to her heart. When she stepped out of the house that night, it was not with triumph, but with a hollow ache that echoed in her chest. The grandeur of the estate she left behind felt like a cruel mockery. She glanced back only once, her eyes lingering on the windows where her children slept, unaware of what had just happened. "I'll come back," she whispered into the still night. The promise meant as much for herself as for them. The ride to the airport was a blur. Her hands trembled as she held her passport, her mind spinning with memories of her children's laughter, their small hands in hers, and the warmth of their embraces. Leaving them behind felt like tearing away a piece of her soul, but she knew she couldn't save them if she stayed. The plane's engines roared as it lifted off the ground. Catherine watched as the lights of Riyadh faded into the horizon. She was leaving behind everything she held dear, but in her heart she clung to the fragile hope of returning. The plane touched down in New York under a grey sky. Catherine felt the jolt of the landing, but her heart barely stirred. She sat motionless, staring out the small oval window at the rain streaking across the glass. The city she had once called home now seemed foreign, its familiar skyline blurred by the storm both outside and within her. At the arrivals gate, her parents were waiting. Her father stood stoically, his shoulders slightly hunched, while her mother, clutching her handbag tightly, scanned the crowd anxiously. When Catherine finally appeared, pale and worn, their relief was palpable. "Oh, Cathy," her mother whispered, pulling her into an embrace. The older woman's frail arms trembled as she held her daughter close. Catherine collapsed into her own tears flowing freely for the first time since she left Saudi Arabia. Her father joined them, his rough hand resting lightly on Catherine's shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. They brought her home to the small suburban house where she'd grown up. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee, and a plate of sandwiches sat untouched on the table. Catherine sat in her old chair, the one by the window, as the rain continued to fall outside. The familiarity of the room was both a comfort and a cruel reminder of everything she had left behind. "I should have done more," Catherine said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Her parents exchanged a glance, their expressions heavy with worry. "You did what you could," her father said firmly. "You're here now. That's what matters." Catherine nodded, though the guilt lingered like a shadow. She knew she couldn't afford to wallow in it. There was too much at stake. The following weeks were a blur of appointments and phone calls. With the support of her parents and a few old friends, Catherine began seeking legal advice. She met with lawyers, explained her situation, and provided every piece of documentation she had managed to bring back. "It's going to be a long road," one attorney told her during a particularly grueling meeting. Custody cases involving international laws, especially in a country like Saudi Arabia, are complicated. And with his financial resources. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Catherine braced herself for the battles ahead. She reached out to human rights organizations, hoping to find allies who understood the complexities of her situation. Some were sympathetic but non-committal, while others offered small glimmers of hope. "We've dealt with similar cases," a kind-faced advocate reassured her during a call. "It's never easy, but persistence is key." And so, Catherine persisted. The legal journey was more harrowing than she had anticipated. Letters arrived, cold and dismissive, from Samir's legal team, rejecting her attempts at mediation. Court hearings were postponed, motions denied, and rulings delayed. Each setback felt like a blow, but Catherine refused to give up. Every night, she sat at the small desk in her parents' guest room, surrounded by files and notes. She pored over every document, every legal precedent, searching for a way to turn the tide. At times, despair threatened to overtake her. Memories of her children, Shazam's shy smile, the twins' laughter, Fatima's quiet curiosity, would surface unexpectedly, leaving her breathless with longing. On those nights, she clung to the thought of their voices calling her Mama, using it as a lifeline to pull herself back from the brink. To sustain herself, Catherine returned to nursing. She found a position at a local clinic, and though the work was demanding, it offered her a sense of purpose. Caring for others became her anchor, a reminder that healing was possible, even in the face of overwhelming pain. Her colleagues admired her quiet determination, though they rarely guessed the depth of the struggles she carried. Catherine found solace in the routine of her shifts, the steady rhythm of helping patients. Each small victory, a relieved smile, A thank you reaffirmed her resolve to keep fighting for her children. Months turned into years, and the fight continued. The obstacles remained daunting, but Catherine had begun to rebuild herself piece by piece. Her voice grew stronger, her spirit steadier. One evening, after a long day at the clinic, she sat with her parents in the living room. The three of them sipped tea as a soft breeze drifted through the open window. "I spoke with the lawyer today," Catherine said, setting her cup down. "There's a chance. It's slim, but it's there." Her mother reached over, taking her hand. "Then you hold on to that chance, Kathy. Hold on tight." Catherine nodded. She would. For her children, she would hold on to every shred of hope, no matter how small. The small room was sterile, its beige walls devoid of any warmth. A single table stood at the center, surrounded by chairs too large for the children who would soon sit there. Catherine smoothed her blouse for the third time, her hands trembling despite the quiet she fought to maintain. A social worker stood by the door, clipboard in hand, offering a polite smile that did little to soothe Catherine's nerves. She glanced at the clock. Any moment now. Her stomach churned as the door opened, revealing a man in uniform, ushering 4 small figures into the room. The children hesitated in the doorway. Shazam, the eldest at 12, was the first to step forward. His face carried the shadow of maturity beyond his years, but his dark eyes betrayed a hint of something softer, something searching. Behind him came his sister, Layla, a few years younger, clutching the hands of her twin brothers. The twins looked to each other for reassurance before reluctantly stepping inside. Catherine stood, her voice catching in her throat. "Shazam! Layla! Boys!" Shazam's gaze met hers for a fleeting moment, and she saw the flicker of recognition. But the others held back, their movements cautious, their expressions guarded. She understood. It had been years. For them, she was a memory softened by time, a figure relegated to faint recollections. "Come, sit," she urged gently, gesturing to the chairs. The children obeyed in silence, their small hands folded on the table. Catherine lowered herself slowly, careful not to overwhelm them with the emotions threatening to spill over. "You've grown so much," she whispered, her words directed at no one in particular. Shazam tilted his head slightly. "It's been a long time," he said, his tone measured but not unkind. "It has," Catherine agreed, her voice trembling. "I've thought of you every single day. I've missed you all more than I can say." For a moment, the room was filled with the sound of Layla's quiet breathing and the fidgeting of the twins, their tiny fingers playing with the edges of their shirts. Shazam's gaze lingered on her, searching for something in her face, as if trying to reconcile the mother he remembered with the woman before him now. The weeks that followed brought more supervised visits, each one offering a glimmer of progress. Catherine came prepared, carrying picture books, crayons, and small toys she remembered they used to love. But it wasn't the toys that slowly began to bridge the gap. It was the stories. During one visit, Catherine leaned forward, her voice soft as she spoke. "Do you remember the song I used to sing before bedtime? The one about the stars?" Layla looked up, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "A little," she admitted. Catherine smiled, humming the familiar tune. Shazam, who had been silent, surprised her by joining in with a few hesitant notes. It was shaky and uneven, but the sound of his voice made her heart swell. The twins, emboldened by their siblings, began humming along too. By the third visit, Shazam's curiosity became impossible to contain. "Why did you leave us?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. The question hung heavy in the air, and Catherine felt the familiar pang of guilt she had carried for so long. She chose her words carefully, knowing the balance she had to strike. "I never wanted to leave," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they love. I've been fighting to come back to you ever since." Shazam nodded slowly, as if processing her answer. He didn't speak, but there was no anger in his eyes, only thoughtfulness. Over time, Shazam began to open up. He shared snippets of their life with their father, the rules, the routines, and the moments when he told his younger siblings stories about their mother. "I told them you didn't forget us," he admitted one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're right," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never did. I never will." Layla, who had been drawing quietly beside them, looked up and smiled, the first genuine smile Catherine had seen from her. The twins, too young to fully understand the complexities, began to cling to Catherine during each visit, their small hands reaching for hers as if to ensure she wouldn't disappear again. With each visit, Catherine's hope grew stronger. Shazam, once cautious and reserved, became her strongest ally. His quiet understanding and growing determination reminded her of the fight she still had ahead. Together, they were slowly piecing back together what had been broken. The social worker took note of the changes, documenting the growing bond and the children's eagerness to see their mother. Catherine's lawyers, bolstered by this progress, pushed forward with renewed vigor. As Catherine left the visitation center one evening, she glanced back to see Shazam waving from the window. Her heart swelled. This wasn't the end of her journey, but for the first time in years it felt like a true beginning. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint shuffle of papers and the rustling of fabric as people adjusted in their seats. Catherine sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her pulse quick and uneven. She glanced sideways at her lawyer, who offered a reassuring nod, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in her chest. On the other side of the room, Samir sat stiffly, his expression unreadable, but Catherine could feel his presence like a weight pressing against her. The judge, a man whose lined face betrayed decades of difficult decisions, cleared his throat. "After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, this court grants shared custody of the children to both parents." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The children will split their time equally between their mother in the United States and their father in Saudi Arabia." For a moment, the room felt frozen. Catherine let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Tears welled in her eyes, a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had hoped for full custody, but knew that this was a victory nonetheless, a chance to rebuild her bond with her children and to offer them a life she had long dreamed of giving them. After all, her sufferings were just fragments of the past. Catherine hugged her 4 children tightly on the trip from the airport to home. That evening, back at her modest home, Catherine prepared a simple meal. The children's laughter filled the air as they explored their new surroundings, their excitement contagious. She watched them from the kitchen doorway, a soft smile playing on her lips. It felt surreal to have them here, under her roof, after years of dreaming and waiting. When the house finally quieted, Catherine tiptoed into their shared bedroom. The twins were nestled together, their tiny hands clutching their blankets. Fatima had her favorite stuffed animal tucked under her chin, and Shazam, the eldest, lay with one arm flung protectively over his siblings. Catherine stood in the doorway, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt a semblance of peace. She lingered there, unwilling to break the spell of the moment, before finally retreating to her room. The days that followed were a whirlwind of discovery for the children. Catherine took them to her favorite spots, the park where she used to jog, the small cafe that served the best hot chocolate, and the library where she had spent countless hours lost in books. She introduced them to neighbors and friends who welcomed them warmly, eager to make them feel at home. Shazam, ever curious and mature beyond his years, asked questions about Catherine's life in America. Fatima clung to her mother, soaking in her presence after so many years apart. Even the twins, though shy at first, began to open up, their giggles filling the house with joy. One warm afternoon, Catherine took the children to the beach. The sand was cool under their feet, the waves rolling in gentle rhythm. They walked along the shoreline, hand in hand, the sun casting a golden glow over the horizon. Shazam pointed out shells to the twins, while Fatima skipped ahead. Her laughter carried on the breeze. Catherine paused, letting the moment wash over her. This was what she had fought for, the freedom to walk with her children, to share these simple joys, to build a future together. She knew there were still battles ahead. Samir's influence loomed, and the shared custody arrangement was fraught with complexities. But, for now, she allowed herself to feel hope. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and pink, Catherine turned to her children, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "No matter where life takes us," she said, "we'll always have each other. That's all that matters." The children nodded, their faces glowing with love and trust. Together, they continued down the beach, their footprints weaving a path along the shore, a testament to a family reunited and a journey just beginning. And that, my friends, is the story of Catherine's incredible journey, a journey of love, resilience, and hope that reminds us all of the strength it takes to fight for what truly matters. If this story touched your heart as much as it did mine, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Catherine's place? Let's keep the conversation going. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and move us to see the world in a different light. Thank you for watching, and as always, take care of yourselves and those you love. See you in the next video.